Okay, good morning, distinguished colleagues and friends, dear Nigel Topping, dear participants. On behalf of GIZ and our international, regional and national partners and co-conveners, I would also like to welcome you warmly to this virtual week on water for development. My name is Mike Ensgard. I'm the GIZ Head of Infrastructure for Energy, Water and Mobility, and I will be your host for this keynote. For all of us, 2020 has really been challenging in many more ways than we expected at the beginning of the year. But still, despite COVID-19, 2020 also remains the thematic year on water and climate change, as it was declared by UN Water. And even though the climate COP26 in Glasgow had to be postponed and the Stockholm Water Week now is solely taking place virtually, we would like to take this opportunity and this year as an opportunity to point out the significance and urgency of climate action on the global scale. And therefore, we're more than happy to have you, Nigel Topping, to join us today as the UK's high-level climate action champion, appointed by the UK Prime Minister. We want to warmly welcome you, Mr. Topping. Let me express my gratitude that you have found the time to speak to us today. Together with the Chilean high-level climate action champion, Gonzalo Muñez, Mr. Topping works on strengthening the collaboration and drive to action among cross-sectoral stakeholders. As climate champions, both coordinate this important work with governments and parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Before being appointed climate champion, Nigel Topping was CEO of We Mean Business, a coalition of business working to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. Prior to that, he was the executive director of the Carbon Disclosure Project, following an 18 years career in the private sector, where he worked across the globe in emerging markets. Nigel, you have the virtual floor, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, good morning, Mike. Let me first of all just check that you can hear me.
You can hear you well.
Great. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Mike, and thank you to GIZ for putting on this event. It's really a pleasure to address you all and to talk about something which is has been for a long time, but very important part of my work and my thinking about climate change, as I'll explain later. You know, I think it's clear that the COVID-19 crisis is having an unprecedented impact on the world. And it's exposing our vulnerabilities, of course, structural vulnerabilities, political vulnerabilities, but also our personal weaknesses in the way that we think about the world and the way that we try to improve the state of the world. As we speak, we're seeing fires raging and tropical storms threatening both coasts of the United States of America, and of course, a third of Bangladesh is underwater. And I think these events are becoming so commonplace as a danger that we become numb to them and forget that behind every one of these headlines there are thousands of human tragedies as people lose their homes and their livelihoods and even their loved ones. So my thoughts go out to all those affected by it now. And perhaps I could ask those of you who are not speaking to go on mute. There's quite a lot of background noise. Thank you. I would say that in no other environmental realm is the impact of COVID more starkly illustrated than in water, because it's in water that we see our first line of defense to tackle disease outbreaks. And that 2.2 billion of our population live without access to clean drinking water, and more than 4.2 billion, more than half of the world's population, live without adequate sanitation services, fundamentally undermines our ability to tackle disease crises such as these effectively. These people are lacking the most basic, the most essential form of personal protective equipment needed to survive and thrive. And terrible though this experience has been and continues to be for many communities and many families around the world, the brutal truth is that it is dwarfed by the effects of climate change, water insecurity, and environmental destruction. However, if there is a silver lining to this tragedy, it is that politicians everywhere are now working to deliver comprehensive economic recovery packages, and that those governments have so far committed well over $10 trillion to COVID recovery. And herein lies a promise and a hope that the question is how those funds will be spent, because those choices will have ramifications for decades to come. We can either stick... Yeah, could you please go on mute, everybody? Thank you. We can choose to stick with the status quo, bailing out high carbon, environmentally damaging industries, and locking in decades of increasingly worse detrimental impacts, or we can choose to put sustainability and resilience as the lens through which we map out our recovery. Of course, you won't be surprised to hear that I favour the latter course. As Mike said, as the UNFCCC high-level climate action champion, it's my responsibility to work with scientists, businesses, investors, cities, to drive action on climate change to get the world to the zero carbon economy by the 2040s, by 2050 at the latest. That's why Gonzalo and I, in our role as high-level climate action champions, launched the Race to Zero a couple of months ago to call on all non-state actors to make their public commitments and make their plans and take their actions to drive that transition to the zero carbon future. And already we have more than 50% of the global economy committed to zero carbon by the 2040s. And our target is to get that to over 70% by COP in Glasgow. But we know that getting to zero emissions is not enough. How we get there, the shape of our economies, the shape of our society is just as important. There is a zero carbon future in which we simultaneously achieve a zero carbon economy, address the fragilities of our current economic system, and tackle systemic inequality. But there's also a future of a fragile zero carbon apartheid, where the haves achieve a zero carbon lifestyle through high technology, and the have-nots achieve a zero carbon lifestyle through lack of access to energy and impoverishment. The latter course, of course, is not resilient, would lead to conflict and collapse. So there can really be only one goal, and that is a resilient zero carbon future. And of course, water plays an absolutely pivotal role in achieving such an ambition. The water crisis and the climate crisis are not two separate events. They're one in very meaningful ways and should be treated as one. Personally, I prefer not to think of the water sector or the development sector. I think sometimes this is a mistake which activists like us, and by the way, you're all activists, even if some of you don't yet self-identify as that, you're all seeking to improve the state of the world, you're acting to improve the state of the world. I think one of the mistakes that activists like us often make is to over-identify with ourselves as a group in the community that as the community that matters most, rather than identifying with what will be most impactful. I've learned this in my work on climate over many years, focusing very much on emissions and emissions reduction, and forgetting that for most people, emissions reduction is a rather abstract concept. And for billions of people living urban lives with shocking air pollution, actually it's the health impact of polluted air, mainly caused by coal and cars, the same things which cause a lot of our greenhouse gas emissions, but framed as health issues. As Maria Naira said when we launched the Race to Zero, 7 million people are dying prematurely every year because of air pollution. If we think of that as the more human issue, actually the more political issue for mayors and those in positions of power around the world who want to be re-elected, then sorting out those premature deaths in the dirty air of our dirty cities is actually more relevant to their roles and more relevant politically and more relevant to people than the more abstract idea of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we should be careful how we frame our work and how we think about our campaigns and our communication, our narrative as activists who are seeking to improve the state of the world. Similarly with water, we prefer to think of water not as a topic just in its own right, but being at the heart of what we might call the race for resilience alongside the race to zero emissions, particularly in three systemic areas. Clearly, water is at the heart of disaster preparation, early warning, and recovery. Not all disasters are water related, but many of them are. And this framing of disaster preparation and recovery is one which resonates with leaders and people around the world. Water is clearly also at the heart of the need for us to build resilient urban infrastructure. Resilient in the human sense that it includes access to clean water and sanitation services, also resilience in the sense that it allows growing urban populations to live with extremes of water, both too much and too little. For example, considering where we build and how we build for the urban population of the future in a world where extreme weather events will be more and more common. And the third system that we like to think about is resilient food systems. Again, clearly water is at the heart of existence for smallholder farmers, the impacts of floods and droughts on agricultural productivity, and on the rural just transition as communities around the world have to adapt will be absolutely clear. In fact, 10 years ago, when I was working at CDP, I launched the Water Disclosure Initiative at CDP because I believed that these issues around water were the most vivid, the most visceral, the most human challenges being thrown up by climate change. And that's why Gonzalo and I are putting water at the heart of the resilience work that we'll be doing on the road to Glasgow. It's also why I'm delighted that the week on water for development is starting today with this theme of climate resilience starts with water. To conclude, water plays an absolutely pivotal role in achieving our ambitions of a resilient, just, zero carbon future. As I said, the water crisis and the climate crisis are not two separate events. They are one. I remember when we launched the Water Disclosure Initiative at CDP, it's about 12 years ago now, Paul Dickinson, good friend and one of the co-founders of CDP, remarked that if you think of climate change as a shark, then water is the teeth. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the GIZ report, Stop Floating, Start Swimming. Gonzalo and I are committed to working closely with all of you, and I hope that what we learned today and for the rest of the week will facilitate stronger, more ambitious dialogues and action from all actors on the road to COP26. I invite you all to join this effort. I look forward to working with you and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for this very interesting start of the morning. It's going to be, I think, a very interesting debate and series of contributions that we'll hear today. But I think it's very encouraging to hear from you in your role from the water community that you place water issues so centrally in your upcoming agenda. So thank you very much for your insights and for being with us today. I have to go back to the control room. We have some good 10 plus minutes for questions and answers, and I understand that they will be typed into the text box here, into the message box. But I need some support from the central control room, how we now manage this. So I can see that we're still waiting for questions to come in. Maybe Nigel, we can have a little bit more information and insight about your concrete sort of upcoming agenda over the next couple of months. So what will be the sort of your role concretely? What will be your activities highlights, and where's there an opportunity to connect for the water community?
So, I think connect is the key word here, Mike, because I think that there's always a risk that that we, as I said, these communities, we talk about the water community, the adaptation community, the mitigation community, end up working too much in their own silos and miss opportunities to align and collaborate. So as I said, Gonzalo and I have launched the Race to Zero, which is very much focused on the mitigation side and has really good momentum. So we'll be continuing to work on that increasingly at a sectoral level. So looking at how do we fully decarbonize transport, built environment, heavy industry, etc. But we're also looking to launch. We probably call it the Race for Resilience or something similar. So there's two races, right? It's almost a yin and a yang, right? You can have, as I said, if you just focus on mitigation, you end up with a world that is not a livable world, really, because it will risk creating this real division. So we must have mitigation and resilience. I use the word resilience rather than adaptation because I think resilience is actually the bigger idea. It's about healthy, thriving economies and communities, whereas adaptation sounds a bit like passive, like what do you do after something's happened. I think resilience includes adaptation. So we'll be launching that in this last quarter. Concretely, there are three important events which we're working around. There's of course the UNGA Week and Climate Week at the end of September. Well, we'll be looking with the Secretary General's team at the initiatives which were launched at the Climate Action Summit last year and looking to make sure that those continue to build momentum. And of course, those included issues around resilience as well as mitigation. Then in October, we have a really important event called Countdown, which we're doing in partnership with TED and Leaders Quest, which will be a global event really for multi-stakeholders, so for indigenous, for youth, for civil societies, business investors, and government, looking at all the different aspects of the work we need to do on climate change. And then in November, in the times that we would have been in Glasgow this year, we'll be holding a series of Race to Zero dialogues, and including a series on resilience and the role of water, as I say, particularly in resilient urban infrastructure and resilient food systems.
All right. Thank you very much, Nigel. While you were speaking, a number of questions have come in, and we have a couple of minutes left to address those. What I'll do, I'll read them out there, very sort of to the point here. So Christine Herbomel asks, Nigel, the apartheid of carbon neutral societies is a very interesting term that I have not heard before. Could you please elaborate more on this, and what steps need to be taken to avoid this? Do you want to take one after the other? There are two or three more, but maybe you can.
Yeah. So I think this is I recently read, and I recommend to anybody the maybe even have it on my desk. No, the work of the International Panel on Social Progress. This is a community of social scientists chaired by Amartya Sen. And they looked at what just as the IPCC and climate or IPBES on biodiversity, they've taken a look at what's a sort of social scientist view of what's needed to enhance social progress going forward. And they come to the conclusion that we really need to solve for three problems at the same time: sustainability, inequality, and freedom. And they basically say if you try and imagine a world where you have two of those three only, it can't really hold together. And as I say, there is a theoretical, but also a very real possible zero carbon future where if you think of it in extreme terms, you have two families, one with a very wealthy lifestyle with electric vehicles and a house with solar panels and zero emissions because of their a technological approach to a high consumption lifestyle, and then another family which has nothing. and emits zero emissions because they're living a life of poverty. And that we know that structural inequality, not that extreme, but that structural inequality exists within the global economy today. And so paying attention to inequality as part of this green resilient recovery, which governments are talking about, will be really important, because exacerbating inequalities leads to conflict in the long run. So I think Sen and his co-authors have published a lovely little book called The Manifesto for Social Progress, in which they describe these three problems we have to solve, and they do a little thought experiment of saying, imagine solving two and not the third, and then just imagine the future. And each time they do a convincing job of saying, actually, it won't really hold, because the system will react in a way as systems do when things get extremely out of balance.
Okay, thank you, Nigel. Maybe I've taken a quick look at the next questions that have come in, one from Felix, one from Thomas Murphy. They're both addressing the issue in a way of decentralized water provisions, and especially in rural areas. There's a question about the role of animals in providing access to water. Maybe can you shed a little bit of light in terms of what you think the global, very sort of up high level climate agenda, in which way this is related to issues of rural water access, especially in distance and deprived communities? Is that of relevance? Can climate, the global climate debate, make a difference to the life of these people?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is why it's important to think systemically. Is why I think this is an issue of, let's say, resilient food systems, right? Resilient food systems, which are largely resilient rural. Of course, there's a technological approach to food systems in urban settings, but I'm really thinking of rural settings. And here we know that decentralized power generation is a crucial part of improving the livelihoods of rural communities. And of course, decentralized power generation can go along with decentralized water provision, because power will often be used to pump water and to power irrigation systems. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a relation to the and that's also very much, we know that the strongly centralized systems tend to be more fragile. They're single points of failure, whereas decentralized systems can be much more resilient. So I think there is a strong connection. That's why I prefer to break it, rather than think of it as water, think of it as kind of the rural transition, which is about resilient food systems, access to water, food generation. There's an employment transition there as well, and it's the issues there are very different from the sort of resilient urban transition systems. Mm-hmm. Issues. Yeah.
Maybe there are a number of further questions, but with respect to the time, maybe we take one more, which is obviously of pressing relevance, and that's the one here related to COVID-19 that Judith is asking. She says, water is critical as a preventive measure for COVID-19, the role water plays in hygiene. But when there's no water, what can be done? How is this? So, I mean, I think there's an underlying question here in terms of how these two big agendas that we have, climate and the post-COVID, how they will probably meet over the next couple of weeks and months, and again, how one will impact the other, and how do you look at this, Nigel?
Yeah, I think this goes back to my point about thinking carefully about the narrative which one chooses as an activist, as a campaigner, to try and bring about change. And there's always a risk that one leads with the thing that one is most passionate about. So that if you think of yourself as a water person, you lead with water, 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 and you become a water bore, because you talk to people about your passion when they're passionate about something else. So I think this is this sort of nexus of COVID, climate, water, adaptation, they all come together. But in terms of, if you like, the politics of change, then health is probably a stronger lead theme. So rather than lead with water and say, oh, by the way, if you fix water, you fix health. It's like here's how we make sure that societies are more resilient in the face of the inevitable future pandemics. I mean, this is what we know, right? That we have known for a long time that the likelihood of pandemics has been risen. Now we're all very aware of it. We know that other pandemics will happen. So I think trying to find nexus narratives where it's not water versus climate or health versus adaptation, but it's like, actually, if you do this, you tackle climate, adaptation, health, economy all together, because those then become political narratives which appeal to many stakeholders, which always have more likelihood of success, I think.
Thank you very much, Nigel. We're coming towards the end of this session, and I think we have to move on in a timely manner so that everyone can join the other session. Thanks to all the participants. We hope that the remaining questions will find room and answers in the course of the day and the week. Nigel, thank you very much. I mean, we in the water community, we've always been concerned about the visibility of water issues around the climate debate. To have you here with us today, I think sends a very encouraging signals to all of us, and we are very hopeful that at the next COP in Glasgow, we will see water as a pressing issue high on the agenda. And we thank you very much for your engagement, for having spending your valuable time with us this morning. Thank you so much.